Little did I realize that being healthy was a good incentive right there. Hi, it's nice to be here. I realized that until Chris had come along today, it wasn't clear to me what I was doing on this stage. As John said, I'm an anthropologist. I work at Intel, and what I want to do for the next 9 minutes and counting down is tell you a different story about data. It's really easy to think about data from the points of view we've heard today, to talk about it as something we move on a cloud, as something that will reside in a server farm. I'm an anthropologist. I can't help but want to ask a different question about data, which in some ways is to paraphrase the Kevin Kelly question of what would data want. I'm much more interested here of who is data, and if it were a person, what would it be like? And there are 8 things I think it would be if it were a person. Number 1 is it turns out that one of the things about data, i.e. long before the digital world came along, there was data. We called it knowledge, information, stories. And indeed, in some places, it was physical objects. One of the things about those physical objects is that they resist being digitized. And there are things in this world that will never want to be digital. They will always want to be physical, material, and real. Like these little tiny plastic Buddhas that you find in a temple in Busan that represent wishes and hopes and prayers that need to be physical in order for those things to come into being. So there's something about data that will resist being incessantly digitized. The second one is that it turns out that we often think of data as being these individual little tiny bits and bytes moving in the network. I suspect it's also the case that data likes a good relationship. And that creates huge challenges when we talk about things like data analytics, when we talk about how it is that we're going to make sense of the information that's being generated. This is a man in India who sells data. He has a kiosk. You'll find people like him in most train stations and in many Indian cities. You bring your phone to this man on a Friday afternoon. He empties all the content on your phone, puts new content on it for the weekend, your weekend content. And then you come back on a Monday morning and he puts new content on it for you. He charges you a fee. This is how you can have 850 million mobile phones in India, all of which have content on it and no traditional network. Imagine what his profile looks like. This is a man who consumes an enormous amount of data because he's aggregating it for everyone else. On the network, he looks like a crazy person. So thinking about here what it's going to mean when data is intermediated, the way we know many forms of social relationships already are, means that data is going to look suspiciously social. We also know that data has a country. It comes from a place, and that context is hugely important. This is a project we've been doing at Intel recently, turning out the contents of people's cars. If you're American, this may look like a car of a serial killer. That is indeed a chainsaw and an axe and several very large knives. If you were from Australia, you would know this was the car of a volunteer firefighter. Serial killer, volunteer firefighter, 2 very different stories that data could suggest to you. And for me, one of the things we need to think about here when we talk about data is to imagine that it can't always be without its context. That some data is going to be so, in some ways, stubbornly of a place and of a particular moment and of a country, that what it means to remove it from that place and that country may mean to render it utterly senseless. I also think it's safe to say that data is going to be feral. I realize as an Australian researcher I use the word feral a lot, but here I mean it in its most classic sense. There are things that are introduced that are initially domesticated, they jump the fence and they run wild. Imagining what will happen as data runs wild means how we think about things like privacy, how we think about things like security, what it's going to mean when data in some ways develops its own patterns and moves far beyond the systems and boundaries and controls that we put on it now. Because chances are multiple people and institutions and social organizations are going to be at work here, and imagining what it looks like as data moves in some ways far beyond its initial spaces, and the meanings that we impose on it, the ways we make sense of it, are similarly unbounded, is for me as a researcher a moment of extraordinary possibility. But I can imagine if you were a regulator, it might be a moment of some fear, because we know that building things like the rabbit-proof fence wasn't a big winner in Australia for containing feral things. So the strategies for how we choose to deal with feralness and feral data are going to be interesting to behold. It's also the case in many places in the world that data doesn't exist absent its responsibilities. I was lucky enough as a child to grow up in a series of Aboriginal communities in Central and Northern Australia, and I continue to get to do research there when I can. This is a colleague of mine who is Diri. He is in southeast and South Australia. In his country, when you tell the stories about his country and the stories of his ancestors' passages across the land, the transmission of that story, of that knowledge, of that data, comes with the responsibility that you have to be the one to keep telling that story, that you have to tell that story right, that you have to tell that story to the right people in the right sentiment, in the right spirit. And that knowing that story comes with the responsibility of how you tell it and how you transmit it. And imagining here the data comes with responsibilities to get it right, to tell it with the right spirit, is a very different way of thinking about what it means to imagine information. It's also the case, I want to argue, that data wants to look good. We heard a number of examples earlier in the day, and I'm sure all of us are willing to admit, at least quietly under our breath, that there are moments when we have lied to the internet. We have checked into places cooler than the places we were in. We have said we were watching television shows we would never watch. We have not said we were watching the television shows we actually watched. We have lied about our height, our weight, our gender, our intentionalities. Sometimes they have been the sins of omission, sometimes they are the sins of commission, but we are always actively choosing to present ourselves in the way that makes us look best. I have a colleague of mine at Cornell University who studies online dating and likes to repeat the statistic that 100% of Americans lie in their dating profiles. What's remarkable about that statistic, it's 100%. In the UK, it's about 60%, which means 40% of them are lying about lying, which is kind of fabulous as an idea. But imagine here that half of what is data turns out not to be true. Now, does that make it uninteresting? Absolutely not. The lies we tell are, in fact, almost as interesting as the truths. So thinking about what it means to imagine that data is actively trying to make itself over is an important way of how we might think about what it means to be in the data frame. And last but by no means least, I think it's the case that not all data wants to last forever. Some things in the world are made to be burnt, they're made to be destroyed, they're made to be given away, they're made to fade. Chris earlier talked about the permanence of data, and I think one of the challenges is as human beings we're used to a certain level of impermanence. And there are things that we participate in, things that we actively engage in, that we do so because, in fact, they will go away. And the notion of what it means to have data that might be impermanent is both an interesting design challenge, but also in some ways the reality of what the world will be like. There are things that people won't want to last forever, and how we choose to design that into a system is, from where I sit, a particularly interesting challenge, but also a particularly strong human reality. And of course, we have to know that even as data disappears, there will always be new data. For me, it's incredibly interesting to spend time with people in their lives, in the places they make meaning in their lives, and track the new stories that people tell, the new patterns that they make, and realizing as we move forward, all of those patterns are going to constitute forms of data that many of us in this room will analyze and traffic in. And what it means then to think about all the ways that data will be generated by human beings, and indeed by the devices they carry, many of whom just blurt out what they're doing, creating whole streams of data, is a sort of truly interesting shift in many ways for what it means for us to talk about data. So my kind of closing thought here, as I was sort of imagining what you would say if you thought about data as a person, and if you started to imagine that data had attributes that looked, if nothing else, remarkably human, that it's stubborn, that it lies, that it wants for things that it can't have, that it wants sometimes not to be big data, I imagine, but somehow small data. Thinking through there about what that really means, for me, then raised this sort of interesting, again, design question, which would be, what if we designed for data the way we designed for people? At the moment, we design for devices that spew out data, but what if we actually started to think about the systems we were building as though they were, in some ways, alive, and inhabited by intentionality and unintentionality, inhabited by a desire to remake themselves? And what would the systems then look like? What does that mean for the network? What does that mean for the ways we put all of these things together? What does it mean for who is going to tell the stories about what data looks like? And for me, all of those become the really interesting things you start to get to talk about if you imagine that data has a life beyond the one that we see on this stage today. So thank you.
That was great.